All right, gang, welcome back to GO2. Today we're going to continue the discussion of the carbon cycle. We're going to get into a couple feedbacks in the system, talk a little bit about biology first, but first and first and foremost, we're going to kind of review what we went through last time. We talked a lot about chemistry, the chemistry of carbon in the environment, and I know that can be a lot to handle if you don't think about it on a regular basis. Excuse me. So last time we said that carbon in the environment is kind of divided up into two different categories here: organic carbon and inorganic carbon. Organic carbon is generally speaking made by biology, by living organisms, and it's the carbon that makes up the tissue. So we have organic carbon and inorganic carbon, and so this our tissue and tissue of all living things is made up of things like glycerol, glucose, and fatty acids, other organic molecules. Mostly, these are made up of these long carbon bonded chains or rings of carbon bonds. Lots of carbon bonds. In general, these inorganic carbon compounds don't contain carbon bonds. They're things like CO2, carbonic acid, H2CO3, calcium or magnesium carbonate, so mineral forms of carbonate. And so that's sort of how we generally divide them. Importantly, these are reduced compounds and these are oxidized carbon compounds. And that plays a key role in biology, really, in life. And so organic carbon, again, is generally associated with living things, lots of carbon bonds, and carbon is in its reduced form. Inorganic carbon, on the other hand, generally is not formed through biology, or it's formed through abiotic chemical processes. It doesn't contain carbon bonds, and it's oxidized, right? And those are all really important things, right? And so we have these two really important redox reactions. Photosynthesis, where CO2 and water are converted into glucose, and then that's processed into other organic material, and oxygen is generated as a byproduct in that process. Respiration is the exact opposite. We're taking glucose or some sugar and we're breaking it down through aerobic respiration using oxygen. We get energy out, and CO2 and water are produced as a byproduct. That's known as heterotrophy as opposed to autotrophy. Okay, and so photosynthesis takes atmospheric CO2, it fixes it into carbon, which is processed into all sorts of different organic molecules. I'm pointing at the wrong screen there. So atmospheric CO2 is processed through photosynthesis, and then biology into lots of reduced organic carbon compounds, organic material. Respiration then takes that organic material, breaks it back down into CO2, and puts it back into the atmosphere. Okay, and so that basically makes up the short-term carbon cycle. You have CO2 out of the atmosphere or the ocean atmosphere system, the environment, fixed into organic material, which is then broken back down into CO2 through respiration back into the environment. So all biomass, both living and dead, was once carbon dioxide, and will eventually, in time, maybe millions to billions even of years, it'll be converted back into CO2. Right, so that's the short-term carbon cycle. It's also mostly the organic carbon cycle, right? Excuse me. So that's kind of distinct from the inorganic or long-term carbon cycle, where we have CO2 and water combining in the atmosphere to form carbonic acid. That's just what happens when CO2 dissolves into water. It first forms this carbonic acid, which then we talked about dissociating into the species HCO3, which is bicarbonate, and CO3, which is carbonate. Right, and so this creates an acid, which then is able to react with silicate rocks on land, or any material on land, really. But in particular, these silicate rocks, liberating calcium ions and transferring that bicarbonate HCO3 to the ocean. And then in the ocean, those two ions can combine to form calcium carbonate, which is a mineral, limestone, which can be stable on long time scales, right? And so through this process, we've taken atmospheric CO2 and we've converted it into an acid first, then we've reacted that acid with a rock, we've transferred it into the ocean as bicarbonate, and then that bicarbonate reacts to form calcium carbonate, right? And those sediments are stable on the ocean floor. And so that series of reactions is sort of summarized here, at least with an emphasis on the carbon, right? We're abbreviating these equations, obviously, right? And so this right here, this silicate weathering, really sums up the long-term carbon cycle. Atmospheric CO2 is taken, converted into a rock, which is stable for long periods of time. CO2 is also emitted to the atmosphere through volcanism, right, and other weathering processes. But in general, this calcium carbonate sediment or some type of carbonate sediment is going to be stable for long time periods. Okay, so through that short discussion there, we've established really three important reservoirs in the carbon cycle: the atmosphere, the biosphere, or just biomass in general, both living and dead, decaying organic material, and sedimentary rocks. Sedimentary rocks can be stable on very long time scales. The biomass that exists on the planet, unless it's buried into sedimentary rocks, it's going to be respired in a fairly short amount of time, right? And so we're really mostly concerned with these connections between each of these reservoirs. So the short-term carbon cycle is really concerned with photosynthesis or primary production, and then subsequent respiration and cycling of carbon rapidly through those two reservoirs. Whereas the long-term carbon cycle is really concerned with this chemical weathering, turning atmospheric CO2 into carbonic acid, and then bicarbonate, and then forming a carbonate rock, which is stable for a long time period until it's subject to volcanism or metamorphism, where that carbon is returned to the atmosphere as CO2, right? And so carbon is continuously being cycled through these two reservoirs as well, but it's at on much longer timescales, right? And so if we're at steady state here, we have two different outflows from the atmosphere and two different inflows, and all of these things have to be balanced if we're to maintain a steady state atmospheric CO2. Okay. And then we talked about in some detail this organic matter burial term here, right? And that's taking biomass out of the short-term carbon cycle and burying it in sedimentary rocks where it's stable, just like the carbonate minerals, for long time periods, right? And so, I keep pointing at the wrong screen here. Okay, and so we talked in some detail about this. Excuse me. So though almost all organic matter produced through photosynthesis, primary productivity is respired back into CO2, much greater than 99%, probably 99.9%. A very small fraction is buried within sediments and becomes part of that sedimentary rock reservoir. This process represents a leak from the short-term to long-term carbon cycle, right? And so just like those carbonate minerals, that organic material is going to remain locked in there until it's somehow weathered chemically. If it's uplifted, it would be oxidized back to CO2, or it could more likely be subducted and volatilized in one way or another. Okay, and so this process takes a really long time, from burial to subsequent exposure and weathering, or conversion through volcanism. Can take a really long time. And so despite the fact that it's this very, very small fraction of total primary productivity that gets buried, it still represents an enormous reservoir, the sedimentary organic matter reservoir. If you remember back to the slide we showed last time, it was the second largest reservoir. About 10 million gigatons of carbon are locked up in sedimentary carbon, organic carbon, and that's compared to about 40 million gigatons as carbonate carbon. And so that's about 1/4 the size of the reservoir. So it's a lot of carbon locked up there. Okay, and it's really important that carbon exists there, because if all the organic matter that was produced was subject to respiration, then all of the oxygen that was produced through photosynthesis would be consumed, and so there would be no net accumulation of oxygen in the atmosphere. And because there are processes, mainly introduction of reduced compounds through volcanism, that actually take oxygen out of the atmosphere, compounds will react with oxygen and take it out. Oxygen wouldn't be nearly as high as it is in the atmosphere today, which is really important for most animal life. Okay. So we talked a lot about this kind of on this little idealized continental margin here. We have an active continental margin. There's some arc volcanism going on here. You have an ocean slab being subducted, and you have the photic zone up here with lots of photosynthesis, lots of primary productivity. You also have a lot of respiration going on in the photic zone, right? Almost all, maybe 99% of the organic material that's produced in the photic zone is respired in the photic zone. It's only a very, very small fraction that sinks out down into deeper waters, right? And so you have some depth profile that looks like this. You have lots of photosynthesis in the surface ocean, and then none below the photic zone because sunlight doesn't penetrate down below that. Respiration, on the other hand, you have pretty high up here in the photic zone still, but below it, it kind of gently tapers off because as you move into deeper and deeper water, there's less and less organic material available for respiration to utilize, and so you get some tapering off. But importantly, you get respiration here of organic material that's below the photic zone, right? And so that has a number of consequences, namely really two. One is that nutrients are constantly being stripped out of the photic zone through photosynthesis, primary productivity, and they're being exported into deep water. And we learned in our discussion of ocean circulation that the surface ocean is stably stratified and doesn't mix efficiently with the deep ocean because of density contrasts, right? And so because of this, you get this nutrient accumulation in deep water and very low nutrients in surface water. This has direct implications for things like upwelling, the distribution of productivity in the surface ocean, etc. Things we talked about last time, right? And it also has a direct implication for this. This is a profile of dissolved oxygen in the water. It's very high in the surface ocean because you have lots of photosynthesis occurring, producing oxygen. But once you get down below the photic zone where it's no longer being produced, oxygen is being consumed through respiration, but not being produced. And so it drops to a minimum. Sometimes it can even become completely anoxic, as the dotted line there shows. And these zones frequently develop along productive continental margins. And we have a special name for them. It's an oxygen minimum zone. Okay, and it says it there. And so there's, despite the fact that there's no oxygen present in there, there's still a lot of respiration taking place. There are lots of other pathways towards respiration that bacteria can carry out in the absence of oxygen. Oxygen just happens to be the most efficient, or it generates the most energy per unit of organic carbon remineralized or oxidized through that process. And so in general, aerobic respiration will outcompete other forms of respiration, anaerobic metabolisms. But in any case, to talk a little bit more about what does that stuff, this is a very recent tree of life. And so this is all of life as we know it right here. And it's divided up essentially into two categories. This is the bacteria there, and this is archaea here, and this is eukaryotes here. And so there are three domains of life: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. We're eukaryotes, and this is a fairly recent division. And it wasn't until I think the 90s when Carl Woese really proposed this, really figured out through DNA that things are more or less divided up this way. And so in general, life, no matter what you're doing, needs energy. Photosynthesizers use solar energy in order to fix carbon dioxide into organic carbon. Chemosynthesis uses chemical energy, oxidation of reduced materials that are present in the environment to fix carbon. So those are two autotrophic metabolisms. And they both use energy from the environment, one chemical, one in the form of light, to fix carbon. Everything else every other form of life is heterotrophic, and it's using respiration of some kind or another, right? And so there are a lot of different kinds of respiration, as I mentioned. And so aerobic respiration uses oxygen as the oxidant, right? And so aerobic respiration is glucose or some organic molecule here, plus O2 goes into CO2 and water. But if O2 is not available in sufficient quantities in the environment, other forms of respiration will begin to outcompete aerobic respiration. And you can use a number of other oxidants here. You can use things like nitrate, NO3, or sulfate, SO4. And so this reaction here is sulfate reduction. And through the reduction of sulfate, rather than water, H2O, you end up with hydrogen sulfide, H2S, which is the rotten egg smell. That's the chemical that gives rotten eggs their smell, right? And that occurs because there's not oxygen inside of that egg, inside the eggshell. Okay, so that's sort of captured here. Nitrate reduction is a similar process. It uses nitrate here, NO3, and it can reduce it into a number of different compounds. But there's a really important process called denitrification that converts nitrate, NO3, back into N2 eventually after several steps. And that N2 is lost to the environment, right? And so just like there's nitrogen fixation that takes environmental nitrogen, N2, and fixes it into biomass, you can also do essentially the opposite. Okay. So this is a table that basically sums up important metabolic processes. We have autotrophy and heterotrophy. Autotrophy is broken up into photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. Chemosynthesis is using reduced forms of sulfur, hydrogen, which is a reduced compound, reduced nitrogen, other reduced compounds in the environment and oxidizing them to gain energy. Both of those are autotrophic pathways. They're fixing CO2 into organic material. Heterotrophy is taking organic material and breaking it back down into CO2, oxidizing it. And it can be done through aerobic pathways using oxygen, or it can be done anaerobically using things like nitrate or sulfate, oxidized iron or manganese. There are other things that can go in there as well. Right, so that basically sums up important metabolisms, and the byproducts of each process are listed there. Right, and these metabolic processes shape the chemistry of our environment, and so they're really important. Right, and this chemosynthesis is a non-trivial piece of the whole puzzle. There are very diverse ecosystems that are found deep on the seafloor around these hydrothermal vents. Excuse me, around hydrothermal vents in particular. At these hydrothermal vents, there's this hot, high temperature water coming out, or fluid coming out, and it oftentimes is rich in reduced compounds, and it's coming out into this oxygenated environment. And so there are chemosynthetic organisms that are exploiting that naturally occurring redox gradient, reduced compounds coming into an oxidizing environment. And so they're using that energy to fix organic carbon, and then that creates a foundation for this food web that exists in this environment. Lots of tube worms, lots of crabs, and those types of things. Probably some fish. Okay, so that's a highly diverse ecosystem in general, and we would call it we would say that's high biodiversity. This term biodiversity means the number of species living in a given area. Oftentimes, the health of an ecosystem is measured that way. You could look at the total productivity of an environment, But that oftentimes is not a good indicator of health of the ecosystem. A good example of that is like a pond on a golf course or somewhere like that, or an agricultural pond where there's lots and lots of nutrients, and there's very few species that live there. Those species are prolific and they dominate the ecosystem, but they're few in number, right? High productivity, low diversity is generally a symptom of an unhealthy environment. In general, health of environment is high biodiversity. Right? Okay, and so a lot of these really high biodiversity environments exist within 10 or 20 degrees of the equator. Really, these tropical ecosystems. They're really an important hotspot for biodiversity. In a similar way, temperate forests are also incredibly diverse in their own ways. You could look at these tropical ecosystems and say that their high diversity is a result of persistent stability, because the tropics don't experience as much seasonal change or as much change as a result of climatic, longer-term climate trends. But you could also make an argument that high diversity is a result of disturbances, and that really kind of gets into this argument about how evolution progresses, whether or not it progresses as a result of changing environments kind of on the periphery of a large population, where there are smaller populations that are isolated, and their environment changes because they're sort of by definition, they're sort of at the boundary of their ecological tolerance anyway, and that environment can be favorable for diversity. And so there are a lot of nuances to that discussion, but it's not really the topic of the course. Nonetheless, a few terms that refer to these things. A population is some number of a single species that are living in a given area. In most areas, there are at least two or more interacting species. They're going to define a community. A community can include any organisms or all organisms that are living in that region. A biome is a community that's characteristic of a certain climate, really. And so biomes change based on temperature and precipitation, and so you have things like deserts or riparian zones, and so you experience different biomes as you move from the equator towards higher latitude. You go from tropical ecosystems up into temperate ecosystems, and then very, very cold ecosystems beyond that. You also similarly experience the same kind of progression through biomes as you move up in altitude. And so as you move from the deserts down here in the valleys, you go from these kind of desert ecosystems, and as you move up the mountains, you get into deciduous trees and pines and things like that we don't really get down here. Okay, and so that's kind of how biomes work. An ecosystem obviously is a community in combination with the physical environment, right? And so if we're talking about the health of an ecosystem, we're talking about the water quality and the air quality, things like that, in addition to the community, right? That's present there. So the living and non-living things define an ecosystem. And then the biosphere is defined as all of the ecosystems on Earth. And so the biosphere then, by definition, includes all the non-living things as well that support life, right? All the soil, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, where's the mouse here? Excuse me. Okay, so getting into carbon cycle feedbacks after that small tangent into biology for a moment. The carbon cycle has, as you might imagine, a whole host of feedbacks. Some are more important than others. There are lots of positive ones, lots of negative ones. But CO2 is really important, right? Because CO2 and water vapor create much of the greenhouse effect, and water vapor content is controlled directly by the temperature of the air, right? We learned that. So processes that modulate atmospheric CO2 have the potential to drive climate change. Processes that modulate water vapor content or concentration are feedbacks generally. And so increasing or decreasing the rate of any process that we've discussed so far, any of those connections between those three important reservoirs, will drive a change in global surface temperature, right? Because it'll drive a change in atmospheric or ocean atmosphere CO2, right? And we've gone through a long, detailed discussion now of how and why CO2 dictates global surface temperature, right? So these processes are complex, and there's a high degree of interconnectedness, and as a result, there are many feedbacks within the system, right? And so here's again these three reservoirs: the atmosphere, the biomass, living and dead, and sedimentary rocks. And so anything that's going to increase or decrease these processes, enhance chemical weathering, enhance volcanism, enhance respiration, or enhance photosynthesis, right? Or organic matter burial, if we can enhance organic matter burial, any of those processes are going to affect the atmosphere, or you could throw in here ocean atmosphere system. Okay. Oh, I was pointing at the wrong one again. Okay. Well, I talked through it anyway. So here are, without further ado, some feedbacks. This is a very simple one to start off. It's just CO2 fertilization. All right, and all this is to say is that if you have a plant, basically any plant that photosynthesizes or any organism that photosynthesizes, if you increase the CO2 concentration in their environment, the relative rate at which they photosynthesize will increase. All right, and that makes a lot of sense if you think about it like this. If there's zero CO2 in the environment, nobody's doing any photosynthesis, right? If there's lots of CO2, they're able to do a lot. It turns out that this is what the data actually look like, and it's not a linear progression, right? There's sort of a maximum extent here, but in this range from about 100 ppm or something, and I'm sure that continues down as you go up until you get to 800 or 1000 ppm, it seems to matter quite a bit. You get significantly increased growth rate at higher CO2 concentrations. All right. So the rate of photosynthesis is related to ambient CO2 concentrations. A plant exposed to higher CO2 will photosynthesize faster. So when atmospheric CO2 rises, the terrestrial biosphere grows, fixing more carbon into organic matter, lowering atmospheric CO2 in the process. This is a negative feedback. Okay, so atmospheric CO2 increases, photosynthesis increases, taking atmospheric CO2 and turning it into organic matter, which causes atmospheric CO2 to decrease, right? Causing photosynthetic rate to slow down, allowing atmospheric CO2 to increase, causing photosynthetic rate to increase, sucking up atmospheric CO2, causing it to go down. So you're just going up and down on this little arc right here, right? It's a negative feedback. Here's a pretty straightforward example of a positive feedback. Okay, melting permafrost. There is lots of organic matter frozen in high latitude permafrost, right? You can just imagine permafrost as soil. Used to be, whatever type of an ecosystem it was, there were soils and they froze. And so there was organic material that's locked up in those soils, or those frozen, or those permafrosts. And when temperature increases, the permafrost melts or thaws, really, and respiration of that organic matter can once again commence, right? It's basically been in a freezer, right? We put food in a freezer to prevent anything from growing, right, or metabolizing, respiring. And so if you freeze that soil, you're preventing any respiration. And when you thaw it and you allow bacteria to grow again, they're going to start doing respiration. They're going to start breaking down that organic material back into CO2, right? And so permafrost melts or thaws, emitting CO2 to the atmosphere, causing temperatures to get higher, causing more permafrost to melt, causing more organic matter to be respired, creating more CO2, causing temperatures to go up, melting more permafrost. This is a positive feedback, right? Because as temperatures continue to increase, more and more permafrost melts. So this is a really extreme example here, this eroding kind of edge. And you can see if this is all frozen soil, it looks like it's densely forested. If this was all frozen previously, and then you're eroding it and transporting it down these streams and rivers, you can imagine how rapidly organic material that's in that would be weathered and respired. Okay. So the next couple of these have to do with sea level, and so these are really specific to glacial times and glacial interglacial cycles. But there are a lot of positive and negative feedbacks that occur on those timescales, and that are related to glacial advance and retreat. And so sea level, as you know, rises and falls quite a bit as glaciers grow and shrink, right? And so the last glacial maximum, about 18,000 years ago, as we'll talk about in the next lecture, sea level was about 200 feet lower, more or less. And so that's a significant distance, right? Significant depth. And as we know, these coastal environments are generally characterized by these low slope platforms up near the coast. And these are, generally speaking, high productivity environments, continental margins, for reasons that we've explored. And so if you lower sea level on these continental shelves, you expose a lot of area of shelf for each kind of unit of sea level that you bring it down, each meter. You expose a larger amount of area because it's a low slope. And so in the process, you're exposing stuff that used to be underneath a high productivity environment, most likely. And so that sediment is going to be rich in organic material and nutrients, probably most importantly. And so as that weathers, when sea level falls, all of that material is eroded and transported back into the environment, and a lot of nutrients are released in the process. Okay, and so let's see here. So many carbon cycle feedbacks are related to the extent of global ice cover. Increasing glacial ice volume causes sea level to fall, exposing shallow continental shelves to subaerial erosion. Subaerial just means above water, exposed to the air. This sediment is rich in organic carbon, organic matter, due to its proximity to continental weathering sources of nutrients and sediment and upwelling. And so when it weathers, it releases nutrients back into the shallow ecosystem, driving productivity and biomass growth, right? So that increase in productivity lowers environmental CO2, driving further ice growth, right? It lowers environmental CO2, lowering temperature, driving further ice growth, which causes sea level to drop further, exposing more of these sediments, which drives productivity further reducing atmospheric CO2 and making temperatures go down. It's a positive feedback, right? Okay, a very similar negative feedback is called the coral reef hypothesis. Okay, and so as ice sheets form, sea level drops. As sea level drops, carbonate shelves are exposed. Okay, and so there are lots of carbonate secreting organisms in the ocean that create reefs. You guys are all familiar with that. Coral reefs, and coral reefs are generally in very, very shallow water because they're all photosynthetic organisms. And so you have these vast stretches of very shallow platform that are made up of carbonate. Okay, and just like we have silicate weathering that takes CO2, turns into carbonic acid, reacts with silicates, delivers cations and bicarbonate to the ocean, where the calcium or the other cation can combine with bicarbonate to form limestone. You can also weather limestone directly, okay, and that's this reaction that's shown here. Calcium carbonate plus carbonic acid turns into calcium and 2 bicarbonates, right? And so through this process, you have efficiently taken CO2 and turned it into bicarbonate, right? And this process also, I would add, occurs very rapidly, okay? And so you're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and turning it into bicarbonate. But when you get to the ocean, you have a problem. You only have 1 calcium, and it came from this calcium carbonate, right? And so all you can do here is turn this back into one calcium carbonate, and you're stuck with another bicarbonate, okay? And eventually, because the ocean is, after all, in equilibrium with the atmosphere, that bicarbonate is going to find its way back into the atmosphere, or at least it's going to force equilibrium. It's going to force some CO2 out of the ocean. Okay, and so through this process, you can very drastically, but only temporarily, reduce atmospheric CO2 through carbonate weathering. Okay, but nonetheless, this is a positive feedback, because as the ice sheet forms, sea level drops. As sea level drops, carbonate shelves are exposed, exposing limestone, which dissolves. Dissolving that limestone lowers atmospheric CO2, right? And so atmospheric CO2 going down makes it colder, which causes ice sheets to grow, exposing more carbonates to subaerial erosion, et cetera, et cetera. It's a positive feedback. Okay. So we've got a few more, well, 2 more really. Excuse me. The next one is terrestrial biomass. All right, and so as climate changes, the biosphere responds. If ice sheets grow on continents, they displace area that was once ecospace, right? It was once area that was available for temperate forests and things like that, right? To live. And so this reduction in the net global photosynthetic production results in atmospheric CO2 increasing, right? This is a negative feedback, right? Because you take atmospheric CO2, you lower it, so temperature gets colder, ice sheets advance, and they cause something that looks like this, where you have lots of forests, lots of grassland, and it turns into this, where you have much less. Biosphere shrinks, and as a result, less CO2 is locked up in the biosphere, and more is out in the atmosphere. And so temperature increases, causing ice sheets to shrink. Okay, causing more CO2 to go into the biosphere, causing ice sheets to grow. Right? It's a negative feedback. It keeps growing and shrinking and growing and shrinking. It's a negative feedback. So that's important. This is actually a very, very strong negative feedback that kind of fights against interglacial, glacial periods. Okay. We also talked about the albedo feedback. That's another important feedback that operates on interglacial timescales. Okay, so we're going to finish our discussion with this. We've got one feedback to rule them all here, the silicate weathering feedback. The silicate weathering feedback obviously involves silicate weathering, which relies on the dissolution of CO2 into rain, creating an acid, and then using that acid to dissolve silicate rocks. Okay, so we're taking atmospheric CO2, dissolving silicate rocks, and then eventually we're going to form carbonate out of that CO2, and that's really the important part. So this process results in the formation of carbonate rocks in the ocean, and therefore is a long-term sink for CO2. This process is temperature dependent in 2 ways. Okay, this is real important. The amount of water in the atmosphere is temperature dependent, right? As we've learned, with higher average global temperatures, you have more water in the atmosphere, right? That is just the fact, right? Warmer air can hold more moisture, and water evaporates, and so warmer air is going to hold more moisture. Okay, and more moisture in the air means more precipitation, right? That's key. More moisture means more precipitation. So higher temperatures mean more precipitation. Okay. The chemical reaction between the acid and the rock occurs more rapidly at higher temperatures. Reactions like this are very temperature sensitive, and so they progress really, really slowly at low temperatures. But at higher temperatures, they react much faster. Okay, and so if you increase global temperatures, right? So higher temperature equals more rain and faster chemical reactions, right? And silicate weathering uses rain to force a reaction between CO2 and rocks that usually happens very slowly. Then, higher temperatures result in an acceleration of this process for two reasons, because higher temperature equals more rain and higher temperature equals faster chemical reactions. Okay, and this process acts to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, lowering temperature. All right, so this is a negative feedback. Okay, higher temperature equals more rain and faster reactions. We're forcing a reaction between CO2 and rocks using rain that usually happens slow if it happens faster. So this process takes CO2 out of the atmosphere, and it happens faster when temperatures are higher, driving CO2 down and temperatures down. When it gets colder, this process happens more slowly, right, and allows CO2 to increase. Right? It is a negative feedback, and it's the main negative feedback that stabilizes climate on long timescales. It's the main negative feedback that has kept the Earth habitable for 4.5 billion years, kept liquid water on the surface of the Earth. Right? It's directly related to a lot of things, but it's directly related to tectonics for sure. Right? Silicate weathering relies on uplift, on some type of topographic relief, mountains. Right? And so through the uplift of new mountain ranges, new rocks are exposed. And when new rocks are exposed, they're able to chemically weather. If the continents were flat, deeply weathered soils, there wouldn't be much fresh material to react with that carbonic acid. Okay. Different types of rock also weather at different rates, for the record. Basalt dissolves much more rapidly than granite, for instance. And so if you erupt a bunch of basalt, a bunch of like continental flood basalts, which happens from time to time, they could weather very rapidly. It's also worth mentioning that those same basalts contain a lot of phosphorus, and so you can drive productivity that way. And so by erupting massive continental flood basalts and weathering them very rapidly, you might be able to draw down CO2 in the atmosphere very, very rapidly, very low. We think that that's what happened about 720 million years ago, when the Earth, the last time at least, the Earth went into this snowball Earth kind of climate state that we've talked about a tiny bit before, where we had continental ice sheets, so mile-thick ice sheets at the equator, essentially, on continents. So a very, very extreme climatic state there. And the trigger for that was most likely the eruption of large continental flood basalts that weathered very, very rapidly. And so it's tied to CO2 drawdown for that reason, obviously. But that same snowball Earth actually provides a really great example of the opposite too, because once all of the continents are covered with ice, there's no exposed rock, right? And so the silicate weathering feedback actually shuts down, and so no atmospheric CO2 is being taken up through silicate weathering, and as a result, atmospheric CO2 is able to just build up and build up and build up and build up and build up until temperature, the greenhouse effect, gets strong enough, despite the crazy high albedo of the Earth at that point. The greenhouse effect gets so high, so intense, that it melts the ice, and it causes this sort of cascade of feedbacks that lead into catastrophic deglaciation, right? And some estimates of what the CO2 required to do that are like 50,000 parts per million, something crazy like that. And so huge levels of CO2, but those would be able to build up. That snowball Earth event lasted something like 50, 60 million years by any estimate. And so over that long time period, without silicate weathering and with volcanoes here and there just poking through the ice, emitting CO2 to the atmosphere, it's able to build up. And if you lower, let me see, where are we here? Right, if you lower this one down to essentially nothing, then you're just relying on this one to build this back up, right? It's just like if you release a whole bunch of nutrients into the ocean, you can ramp this photosynthesis up so that it takes up a whole bunch of atmospheric carbon and puts it in biomass. If at the same time you're ramping up chemical weathering, you're taking a whole bunch of CO2 and putting it into the ocean as bicarbonate, creating much sedimentary rocks, then you're taking atmospheric CO2 out both sides rapidly, right? And so it's all about it's all about carbon, and it's all about the intersections or the interfaces between these reservoirs, right? And so that's really what climate science is all about. I think I said that in the first day of class, that climate science is really all about feedbacks. It's all about how one component of a system relates to other components of the system, and how those all work together to modulate CO2 at the end of the day, because CO2 and water work together to create the greenhouse effect, which dictates how much energy we have at the surface of the Earth, right, in the superficial system here. That controls how big the reservoir of energy is, right, because it controls how fast the energy gets out, right? So really important stuff. Thanks very much for listening, and I will I'll see you again soon. The next lecture is going to be on it's going to finish with this stuff, so we won't talk more about the carbon cycle directly, but we're going to move on with short and long-term short and long-term climate records, and so we'll talk about how we reconstruct past climate, past temperature in particular, and we'll also talk about why the record looks the way that it does. So thanks. See you next time.